A man sits in silence. The chair beneath him creaks, but he doesn't move. Across from him, an empty one waits, not for a person, but for a memory. The person he's here to forgive is gone, dead. The harm they caused was undeniable, a rupture that shaped years of his life. And yet, something inside him plays it back, again and again, as if the past is not done with him. He wonders, why can't I let this go? But perhaps the more curious question is, why do some people forgive the unforgivable? For centuries, forgiveness has been framed as a moral triumph, a choice, an act of compassion, even a spiritual awakening. But what if forgiveness is none of those things? What if it's not a virtue at all, but a neurological event? What if it lives in the same brain circuitry as fear, memory, and pain, not as a noble decision, but as a cognitive recalibration? Neuroscientists are beginning to map this hidden terrain, discovering that forgiveness activates the brain's reward centers, dampens stress hormones like cortisol, and even reshapes the autobiographical self. And yet, in the face of betrayal or trauma, most of us find it agonizingly difficult. Why does the brain resist forgiveness, especially of betrayal, more than physical violence? And could forgiveness be taught or trained, like language, or music, or empathy? This is the paradox we begin with. Science shows forgiveness can heal us, body and brain, yet the very organ that benefits most is often the one that won't allow it. Forgiveness, once revered as a sacred act, has deep roots across ancient civilizations. In Christianity, it was framed as divine mercy, to forgive as God forgives. In Buddhism, compassion and non-attachment formed the core of releasing anger. Judaism offered structured atonement rituals, where forgiveness wasn't just emotional, but moral and communal. These traditions treated forgiveness not only as possible, but as necessary for spiritual survival. Yet the brain tells a more complicated story, one written long before religion. From an evolutionary perspective, early humans depended on threat detection, vengeance, and memory encoding to survive betrayal. Neural structures like the amygdala and hippocampus evolved not to forgive, but to remember danger. Betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Revenge wasn't pettiness, it was survival. But then came a shift. Charles Darwin, often remembered for survival of the fittest, also wrote quietly and profoundly about sympathy. In lesser-known passages, he proposed that our moral instincts, our capacity for empathy and forgiveness, evolved not despite survival, but because of it. Cooperation, after all, builds stronger tribes. Fast forward to modern neuroscience, and the story gets even more intriguing. Studies now show that people who practice forgiveness have lower rates of heart disease, reduced inflammation, improved immune function, and decreased cortisol, the stress hormone that silently wears down the body. In brain scans, those who forgive regularly show stronger connections in regions associated with emotional regulation, empathy, and narrative self-reflection. And yet, in trauma therapy rooms around the world, patients often say, "I can't forgive. It feels like betraying myself." For those who have survived deep harm, forgiveness doesn't feel healing. It feels dangerous, as if letting go is the same as condoning, as if to forgive is to forget, or worse, to lie. This is where modern psychology steps in with a bold, uneasy question. Can forgiveness be taught? Emerging techniques like fMRI-guided neurofeedback, compassion meditation, and trauma-informed somatic work suggest yes. They offer a model not of moral obligation, but of neuroplastic possibility. And the stakes are rising. In a world increasingly shaped by grievance, trauma, and cycles of retaliation, both personal and political, the inability to forgive doesn't just harm relationship, it may erode the brain itself. So what happens to a society, or to a human mind, that never learns to forgive? This isn't just a spiritual inquiry anymore, it's a biological. In 2003, a quiet revolution began in the field of forgiveness science, sparked not in a lab, but in the aftermath of personal tragedy. Dr. Everett Worthington, a clinical psychologist and professor, faced the unimaginable. His mother was brutally murdered in a home invasion. But rather than turn away from the pain, Worthington turned toward it and towards science. Driven by both grief and curiosity, he began studying the psychology and neuroscience of forgiveness, not as a lofty ideal, but as a biological process. In a groundbreaking experiment, he asked participants to vividly recall a moment of deep betrayal, and then, in a separate condition, to imagine forgiving the offender. The results, captured through brain imaging, were startling. When participants relived the hurt, activity spiked in the amygdala and insula, regions associated with fear, anger, and rumination. But when they engaged in forgiveness, something else happened. The prefrontal cortex lit up, especially areas tied to empathy and self-regulation. The default mode network, linked to introspection and identity, also activated. The brain, it seemed, was not just feeling differently, it was thinking differently. Forgiveness, in this light, appeared not as an emotion, but as a cognitive transformation. And yet, here lies the dilemma. Science shows that forgiveness helps the forgiver, reducing stress, improving mental health, even restructuring neural pathways. But what happens when the crime is not personal, but systemic? When justice is absent? For victims of racial oppression, abuse, genocide, or political violence, the suggestion to forgive can feel not healing, but hollow. In such cases, forgiveness may seem like erasure, a betrayal of memory and morality. Neuroscience may prove that forgiveness eases suffering, but it cannot easily answer the ethical question, should it be expected? In recent years, forgiveness has become a tool in unexpected places. Prison reform programs, restorative justice circles, trauma recovery workshops. Advocates point to its power to break cycles of violence, but critics raise a pressing concern. Are we using neuroscience to bypass moral outrage, to biohack peace by dampening anger without addressing the causes of that anger? Is forgiveness being repurposed as a form of control, a way to soothe the brain without confronting injustice? This is the contradiction at the heart of modern forgiveness science. It may ease the burden on the individual, but at what cost to collective memory and moral clarity? Forgiveness, as illuminated by neuroscience, is far from a singular act. It's a layered negotiation between biology, memory, justice, and identity. At the heart of its complexity lies memory itself. Emotionally charged memories, especially those tied to betrayal or trauma, are more deeply encoded in the brain. The amygdala tags them with urgency, while the hippocampus stores their context. These memories are stickier, not because we're weak, but because our brains evolved to remember what hurts. Forgiveness, then, is not simply about moving on. It requires reprocessing these memories in a way that reduces threat without erasing truth. Therapies like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and somatic experiencing attempt to do just that, uncouple memory from alarm. Still, the biological reflex to protect, to remember pain, makes forgiveness feel unnatural. This isn't just emotional, it's neurological. That tension deepens when we place forgiveness alongside justice. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is often hailed as a model of collective healing, where victims publicly forgave their oppressors in exchange for truth, not punishment. But decades later, critics ask, did those acts of national forgiveness rewrite history or whitewash it? When forgiveness becomes institutional, it walks a tightrope between healing and historical erasure. Neuroscience may show how forgiveness calms the mind, but it cannot measure the cost of forgetting in moral or cultural terms. On an individual level, brain imaging adds yet another layer of contradiction. Scans reveal that during the act of forgiveness, activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for detecting errors and violations, actually decreases. In other words, forgiving feels, neurologically, like letting someone get away with something. To forgive, the brain must override the signal that says, this was wrong. That's why, especially at first, forgiveness can feel like lying. Even more troubling is how forgiveness can be weaponized. In cases of abuse, manipulation, or spiritual trauma, victims are often pressured to forgive, not for their own healing, but to absolve the offender. In dogmatic religious environments or emotionally coercive relationships, forgiveness becomes a form of control, If you truly loved me, you'd forgive me. Can neuroscience help distinguish genuine, embodied forgiveness from its distorted, performative version? This is an urgent question, especially when forgiveness is expected without accountability. Finally, there is the haunting legacy of intergenerational trauma. Epigenetics has revealed that trauma doesn't end with the person who experienced it. It leaves molecular imprints on DNA, passed down like a shadow. Can forgiveness interrupt that cycle? Can the act of reprocessing pain, not just cognitively, but biologically, soften the stress responses inherited from parents and grandparents? If so, forgiveness is not just personal, it becomes ancestral. The stakes are immense. Forgiveness may be a path to healing, but it's also a battlefield of memory, morality, and meaning, one that every brain must navigate in its own way. The turning point in the science of forgiveness arrives not as a moral revelation, but as a neurological. Forgiveness isn't a conscious decision, it's a biological transformation. Recent research using advanced neuroimaging has revealed something astonishing. When a person truly forgives, the brain produces a distinct and measurable pattern, a neurosignature not of forgetfulness but of compassion. The areas involved, notably the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, and parts of the limbic system, don't go quiet, they harmonize. This pattern doesn't resemble denial or repression. It resembles empathy, self-regulation, and a sense of reconnected identity. And here's the twist that changes everything. Forgiveness doesn't erase the memory of pain. Instead, it rewires how the brain relates to that pain. In longitudinal studies, people who engage in sustained forgiveness practices report not only emotional relief, but changes in their autobiographical memory itself. They literally recall the event differently. The timeline shifts, the emotional charge fades, the narrative softens from victimhood to agency. The past remains, but its grip loosens. This is neuroplasticity at work. The brain is choosing not to condone, but to evolve. In this light, forgiveness is not weakness. It is not sainthood. It is survival. It is the brain's way of breaking the loop, of building a future that is not entirely dictated by the circuitry of the past. Far from being an abstract virtue, forgiveness emerges as a radical act of neural self-preservation, one that allows the mind not just to heal, but to become someone new. As the neuroscience of forgiveness comes into focus, a remarkable pattern has emerged, not just in theory, but in the brain itself. Forgiveness, we now know, strengthens neural pathways between the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, reflection, and control, and the limbic system, where emotion, threat detection, and memory reside. This connection is crucial, especially in trauma recovery, where the body often remains locked in cycles of fight or flight long after the threat has passed. In these cases, forgiveness is not about forgetting or absolving. It's about uncoupling memory from physiological reactivity. It allows the brain to recall without relapsing into fear. Therapeutic tools like compassion meditation and mindfulness are showing promise in this arena, consistently activating the same brain regions that light up during acts of forgiveness, especially the temporoparietal junction, which supports empathy and perspective-taking, and the anterior cingulate, which helps regulate emotion and resolve conflict. Forgiveness-based models, such as Everett Worthington's REACH method, recall, empathize, altruistic gift, commit, and hold, have shown measurable reductions in anxiety, depression, and even chronic pain. Meanwhile, cutting-edge research is beginning to harness artificial intelligence to detect signs of unresolved trauma, not through traditional talk therapy alone, but by analyzing micro-expressions, voice modulation, and movement patterns. These insights are opening the door to personalized interventions that can guide individuals toward forgiveness, not as an abstract goal, but as a biologically supported pathway to peace. The applications ripple far beyond individual therapy. In trauma healing, forgiveness helps restore agency. In criminal reform, it can interrupt cycles of vengeance and reoffending. In conflict resolution, it offers a space where mutual humanity might re-emerge. And in families marked by historical wounds, addiction, war, abuse, it provides a rare tool for intergenerational reconciliation. But as powerful as this science is, it comes with profound ethical questions. Can we apply it without erasing history or silencing righteous anger? Can forgiveness be supported without being prescribed? Who has the right to forgive, and who deserves to be forgiven? These are not questions neuroscience can answer alone. They live at the intersection of biology, morality, and memory. What science can offer is clarity. Forgiveness is real. It's physical, it's measurable, and above all, it's a choice the brain can learn to make, not in place of justice, but perhaps in pursuit of something even more enduring, healing. He stands slowly. The chair's groan echoes in the quiet room, but he doesn't flinch. Something has shifted, not erased, not forgiven in the simple sense, but softened. He hasn't forgotten what happened. The pain didn't vanish, and the memory remains as vivid as ever. But it no longer owns him. There's a space now between the remembering and the reliving, as if some inner gate, long rusted shut, has creaked open just enough to let the air through. He steps outside. The morning light touches his face, not as a metaphor, but as a fact. The sun is rising, just rising. And for the first time in a long time, he notices. Forgiveness, he realizes, is not the end of anything. It's the quiet decision to keep going, to live one more day without yesterday tightening its grip around today's throat. It's not an act you perform once, then move on. It's a pattern your brain slowly learns, through reflection, through effort, through grace. And sometimes, in a world that teaches us to guard, to remember, to retaliate, the most radical thing a brain can do is choose peace. So here is the lingering question. What if your brain, brilliant, protective, resilient, was never built to carry this forever? What if letting go isn't weakness, or forgetting, or surrender? What if it's simply remembering without bleeding?